Hello, brothers and sisters. I did a little bit of reviewing of the books that I had. I'm going to try to straighten out the camera a little bit, sorry. So after I did some reviewing of the books that I intended to read to y'all, I realized that there's a lot of information here. So I thought it would be beneficial just to do a video kind of outlining some of the important points. So in Pagan Christianity by Frank Viola and George Barna, they just kind of outline for you in a very simple way what an actual liturgy looks like. And that's under the order of worship, Sunday mornings set in concrete. So the order of worship, they call that the worship service, and that is synonymous with a liturgy. So as we go through this, the real picture we want to always bear in mind, no matter what we're studying, is do we believe in God? And if we do, how does he stand in relation to this information? And how does he stand in relation to us? Does he just confer with the kings? Does he confer with people that are on the lower social class, or is he just an upper class God who deals with them? So we can really get an idea. So do we need to go to a holy ground on a Sunday that they call the church, or does he reign as close down to us and in us? And how does he fit into the paradigm of the world that they have, where they have these people that they set as kings? So these are all answered in the Bible, and they're all very apparent once you really contemplate those ideas, like I just explained, that whether or not Jesus is a friend, or if he's someone who's far away, someone who doesn't care about us, like the deist God, right? So in my mind, a lot of those ideas are utter blasphemy, but to even clarify it for a person who may never have even contemplated these things at all, it really helps draw out the point that we're trying to make here, that God is close to us. God reigns through us. That word synergos, and even the word enthusiasm in the Greek and Latin, the origin of Greek and Latin words dictionary that I have by More and More, they explain that the word enthusiasm has the meaning of God working through a person, because that comes from theo, or theos, and theos is God. So the Greek word for God, Elohim, is the Hebrew word for God. So enthusiasm is the idea of a person having zeal and having that baptism that gives us that zeal of the Spirit, that gives us the charisma to do the things of God, comes directly from God. And there's a lot in the scripture on that. So the reason we need to bear that in mind is because we're speaking of the dogma and the charagma, the mark of the beast, which is the world ruling authorities, and their stamp on religion. And we're explaining that stamp, that mark of the beast, by showing what men have made up and what they have characterized as the way a believer ought to behave and think. So it says right in here, and it's speaking of Luther's contribution, and it says what follows is Luther's order of worship. The general outline should look very familiar to you, for it is the taproot of the Sunday morning church service found in most Protestant denominations. And we know Protestantism is just Reformed Catholicism. They're doing the same exact thing as Catholicism, they just change the names and do the same thing. So it says singing, prayer, sermon, admonition to the people, Lord's Supper. And when they say that, they're talking about a thimble of grape juice and a thimble of our little piece of cracker, which is not what the Passover was at all. Passover was eating an entire meal together like they did. So it's been popularly called the Lord's Supper, but it's the last Passover supper before the nailing to the cross, which did away with the rituals. So it says singing, post-communion prayer, and benediction. So then it goes on and it shows what Calvin's looked like. And it says as Calvinism spread throughout Europe, Calvin's Geneva Liturgy was adopted in most Protestant churches. It was transplanted and took root in multiple countries. Here is what it looks like: prayer, confession, singing, psalm, prayer for enlightenment of the Spirit in the preaching, sermon, collection of alms, general prayer, communion at the appointed times, while psalm is sung, and benediction. So it says what follows is the Puritan liturgy. It says compare it to the liturgies of Luther and Calvin, and you will notice that the central features did not change. Call to worship, opening prayer, reading of scripture, singing of the psalms, pre-sermon prayer. Sorry, I was checking the time. It says sermon, post-sermon prayer. When communion is observed, the minister exhorts the congregation, blesses the bread and cup, and passes them to the people. And then it goes on to say the free churches created what is called the hymn sandwich, and this order of service, or the liturgy, is quite similar to that used by most evangelical churches today. Here's what it looks like: 3 hymns, scripture reading, choir music, unison prayers, pastoral prayer, sermon, offering, benediction. Does this look familiar to you? Rest assured, you cannot find it in the New Testament. So, let's see. All right, so I want to read more out of that to y'all, but like I said, I just want to cover some of the information in the books. I was skipping around just then, and then I'll come back and actually read some of the articles from you so you can get a little better understanding of how the authors put that together. But I just want you to understand what the liturgy is. So here in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament by Gerard Kittel, we just finished reading that a little bit from an entry on pagan Christianity by George Barner and Frank Viola. Now we're moving to this book, which is, again, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament by Gerard Kittel, under liturgeo and liturgia, the origin of the word liturgy. So it says, the modern ecclesiastical use of the word liturgy is quite different from the original of liturgeo and liturgia, which were wholly secular terms. So entirely secular terms. So notice how it says that the use of the word is different. Well, if it's different here in this, where we get our word liturgy, well, the word church and the word ecclesia, in the word ecclesia, it says that it needs linguistic sobriety, an accurate understanding of what the word means. So, sorry, my arms are itching from this shirt because I just took it out of the dryer, so it's kind of making my skin itch. So, sorry. So, what happens is, why does he have to say that about the changing of the meanings of words? Well, that's very important to understand. That's why we're doing these studies, is because the meanings of words have changed. So he goes on to say, on the other hand, it bears some relation to non-biblical usage. Nevertheless, the only way to understand the change in meaning is by way of the Septuagint, the LXX, and its almost uniform cultic and priestly use of the words. So that's important, because in Philip Schaff, The History of the Christian Church, we read from the entry clergy/laity, and we found out that the reversion back to these rituals is based on the Jewish history of the Levitical priesthood and its priests. That's why they reverted back to those rituals that were being carried in the temple that we see in all of these churches, which is never supposed to be the case. And the Greek heathens, the Grecian philosophers, who had their priest and their sacrifice. So the idiom was just wrapped up into this combination of the liturgy, as we'll see an example of in Harvest of Hellenism by Effie Peters. So it says here, and he goes on to say this too, watch. The ecclesiastical use is the result of a transfer to the Christian cultists of Old Testament concepts in Greek garb. So the Jewish Levitical priesthood of a literal temple service transferred to the Christian cultists in Greek garb. The Plato and Aristotle and the academies and this philosophical thinking wrapped up in this hierarchy view of the Levitical priesthood and the priests, and regaining ground as the Christian cultists got further away from Jesus and became confused and back at it. The whole thing that Jesus came to set straight, being confused again. So it says, this may be seen very clearly in the literature of the 4th century. So from 300 to 400, the 4th century. So what we see in that time is Constantine and the Council of Nicaea. And that's why we covered dogma, charagma, stigmata, the word mark. So that's what I meant to say yesterday. I think I actually confused that. I meant to say dogma, charagma, which is mark, and stigmata, which means the stamp, as in the slaves' mark from the temples that they went to. We see this in prisons and gangs and tribalism. They mark themselves according to the gangs or the tribes they're associated with. So the role played by the New Testament in this history of signification, will have to be determined in what follows. So understanding it, as Philip Schaff explains under the clergy laity entry in his book of encyclopedias, we see that they reverted back to the Grecian heathenism and the Jewish old temple services. So that's enough on that for now. Like I said, I would like to read more from each one of these. So just to get an idea of where this word liturgy, or this idea as these worship services, and knowing that they weren't originally in the New Testament with Jesus. Jesus was not performing these modern concepts of a liturgy. So here in Harvest of Hellenism by Effie Peters, he explains that I can go ahead and read more of this. So it says, it says, what changed, what changed in the century between BC 400 and BC 300 was that the cults of the East could travel over freshly smoothed paths into Greece. So they could go from the east to the west in this freshly new way. So there were, moreover, new forces urging them down those paths. For the Hellenistic, the Grecian, monarchs' religion was a powerful propaganda weapon in the successors' endless struggle for political domination. So, for the Hellenistic monarchs, religion was a powerful propaganda weapon in the successors' endless struggle for political domination. So, what that's saying is the Grecian monarchs knew that they could use religion as a form of political domination. Domination. It sounds so much like denomination, it keeps messing me up. So that's what we were speaking of before about the nationalism and religious tie. The way that patriotism is a religious ritual, and we see it carried out like a liturgy. All rise for the playing of the national anthem. Now we're going to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And then they have their dismissal or their little liturgy like we read about in pagan Christianity just a moment ago. So it goes on to say, no one used it more effectively than the Ptolemies of Egypt. And that's where we see the Septuagint was written for the Ptolemies, because they were wondering what these Jewish people believed. So it says, in the days of the Roman Empire, the Egyptian goddess Isis was celebrated everywhere with an elaborate ritual and a complementary mystery cult. But she was not the first god to come forth from Egypt in Hellenistic times. So during the times that the Grecians were influencing that area. So that's what Hellenism means. Before her, the Eastern Mediterranean was drawn, or rather summoned, to another Egyptian deity, Serapis, who owed his brief but brilliant career to the political astuteness of Ptolemy I Soter. So, Serapis was brought back to the forefront there because it explains who owed his brief but brilliant career to the political astuteness of Ptolemy I Soter. So he knew how to use these cults. So, and like we said, was celebrated everywhere with an elaborate ritual, speaking of Isis. So that's what we're explaining, the amalgamation and the political usage of these different religious understandings and wrapping them together. So it says, some version of or other of Serapis was current in Egypt before Alexander arrived there, and probably combined the features of Osiris and the bull god Apis. The cult center was at or near Memphis, and it was there that Ptolemy came upon it in its native Egyptian form. At this early stage of his career on the Nile, Ptolemy may still have been concerned chiefly with consolidating his position in Egypt, as attested to by his interest in the Alexander cult. But with the decisive events of BC 312, he stood full center on the stage of Aegean politics. His deliberate involvement in Syria, Cilicia, Greece, and the islands showed that his mind had turned to empire. And Serapis was to be his ecumenical god, the one to unite them all together. The cult center was moved from Memphis to the magnificent Serapeum at Alexandria. A Greek sculptor devised an appropriate cult image, and the two religions eminences of the time, the imported Eleusinian priest Timotheus and the Hellenized Egyptian priest Manetho, took a hand in Hellenizing the liturgy and the accompanying myth. So they combined them together. And they made the the Grecian liturgy and the accompanying myth. So they took all those Grecian gods and wrapped them together, and those Grecian cults and their liturgies, and made one that would bring in the religion vacuum together into them. So the result was a partially Hellenized version of an Egyptian religious phenomenon. So the result was a partially Hellenized version of an Egyptian religious phenomenon. Intelligible, it was thought to Greek and Egyptian alike, and eminently suitable for export. So they wrapped it up, made it look nice, and now they could ship it as a gift to other people. Serapis did take up residence abroad in Sicily, Athens, and particularly within the Ptolemaic sphere of political influence, on the Aegean Islands and in the Polis of the Anatolian coast. His personal reign proved ephemeral. The dream of empire dissipated as Ptolemaic power receded into Egypt, and the cult of Serapis suffered the congenital weakness of political religions. They expand and contract in proportion to the political power that supports them. So that's important. What it's saying is it's these different religions that are created, and we see them come and go. So the oligarchies that are behind them that serve to profit off of these little churches that are built in these different demographics, once they stop receiving the great support as they did in the beginning when the excitement first began, they lose their power as different rich people withdraw and move on to something that they view as bigger and better things. So it says it is likely that Serapis would eventually have retreated back into the tomb of Apis at Memphis had it not been for his connection with a far more potent figure in the same myth complex, his consort Isis. So it goes on, and over here it says there was 42 Serapeums at Alexandria alone, and each was celebrated the daily liturgy in honor of Isis. Other gods might have occasional feast days in the Roman fasti, but Isis was honored every day in her temples. So it goes on and it says, it is not difficult to understand the appeal of Isis. Constantly before the eye of the believer, she was the protected and celebrated object of a highly organized cult apparatus that had all the appearances of a church. Wow. So it's important to understand these things, and what this has all triggered for me is something that I want to discuss with y'all very thorough again. And I had discussed this with y'all before, but I'm also going to put it in the description. And if I forget, sorry, and I'm going to try to remember to put that in there that I did from The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop, because I want to read that. And I want to share it with you because it's so important. Because we get that merc, M-E-R-C, in these different words, like a merchant or a market, or a commerce. We see that merc in there, and I was explaining that Mercury, not the planet, but the god, it comes from the same as Hermes, and Her is connected to Ham because Her in Egypt means the same thing that Ham means, this idea of this blackness of sin and this darkness, but it's connected to the sun because it has the idea of that burning, and the sun is the burning one, and that's what Hermes, Mercury, and Ham or Cush and Nimrod all connect to, and we see it through the sun. So the knowledge of the sun, and that's where we get the word hermeneutics, and these different ideas connected with sun as representing primordial knowledge, and the corruptions that accompany that are evident in the mercantilism, and that's the whole corruption of everything when you start selling it and trying to make money off of it. Socrates was outraged that they accused him of selling his teaching function, and that's exactly what we see in public schools and the different sponsors behind judges or the sponsors behind politicians. Is the love of money is the root of all evil, and they turn these things into a house of merchandise or a den of thieves as they try to find different ways to make money. So I know that's an awful lot, and I'm trying to tie a lot of concepts together, but I'm going to now continue and read to you from this idea of liturgy. And the liturgies, as we see in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament under liturgy, is very understood as a way to govern people, as we call it a census, to take people's money, to get a good account of how many people are in your empire and how much money you should raise when you tax them, and to keep them under that nationalistic myth and tie that into the nationalistic religion. And we're going to see that very clearly, the way that the authorities use that religion to accomplish their ends. And that's the temptation to wrap the religion into the nationalism. So it says here, and I've read this to you before, but I want to tie it to Harvest of Hellenism here. So it says, only Roman citizens had access to the law, the distinctive mark of their citizenship. But access to the law was not an easy matter. With its root in religion, law is rooted to religion because the law makes you go through a ritual. Legal practice was not unlike the performance of a liturgy. Of course, you have to, right? Things had to be done in precisely the right way. Scrupulous attention was paid to the form, the ritual, the religion, right? The correct formula had to be used, and the proper days had to be observed in bringing matters before the courts. At first, all such knowledge was esoteric and belonging exclusively to the College of Pontiffs. So that's very important to understand, the College of Pontiffs, because of the college aspect. This group of ruling men who are in control, like an oligarchy, are oligarchical in nature. These archons, these rulers who exercise lordship and exercise authority upon people in spite of God saying, hey, we don't need you, God. We'll listen to men and we'll listen to their laws. Forget your laws. We're going and following man because we can make some money. We can move up that way. We can become a hierarchy and move up the hierarchical scale and climb the ladder of success. So it says, by the time of Caesar, the pontiffs numbered 16, presided over by the Pontiff Maximus. The Collegium Pontificum included others, the Flamens, a group of 15 priests, the 6 Vestals, and the Rex Equorum. And remember, this is way back 400 BC, way before 325 AD, when the Roman Catholic Church started. Roman Catholicism is Roman Caesar worship, apotheosis, and heroification. And that's what we see happening in families, in neighbors, in friends, in churches, in schools, in sports, raising men up and heroifying them and deifying them and viewing them as apotheoses, as gods. So, and the Rex Sacrorum, the king of the sacrament, its role was to supervise the state cult, nationalistic religion. So, and to advise the magistracy on its sacral functions. But the practice emerged of publishing lists of the necessary forms, these liturgies, right? The first in 304 BCE, and then of producing more elaborate treatises that discussed specific points of law. This made litigation easier and served to restrict the somewhat arbitrary power of the pontiffs. So, writing it down so they had something, the guidelines to follow. And that gets corrupted very quickly, doesn't it? So, in here, there's another spot, and it's explaining the same thing, but in a Christian light, of how we have a God-given organization and a God-given life that we're supposed to share. And that's what it was explaining there with the College of Pontiffs, that at first it was more of a shared thing before it came to the Caesar. So it explains here, it says that an early tradition made Peter the first bishop of the Church of Antioch before Evotus and Ignatius. The tradition is not impossible, and that Peter worked there on occasion is almost certainly true. But it is difficult to reconcile a lengthy stay there with the Roman tradition of a 25-year-long episcopacy in the capital before his death there in AD 64. In Jerusalem, James governed in concert with a collegium of elders. So, in Jerusalem, James governed in concert with a collegium of elders. So it's speaking of the way that we're not supposed to set a man up on center stage, and Peter certainly didn't. That would mean that he would have had to apostatize at the end of his life from the faith. So when you start speaking of these hierarchical structures and these man-made positions of a flattering title and degree. So in Jerusalem, James governed in concert with a collegium of elders, and there is no visible distinction in being between the bishop and the presbyters. Exactly, because the people are working together. There's a synergy. There wasn't this bureau that had been made yet. That's not till later on, as the corruptions kept building steam and snowballing as they were wrapped up into an exact formula. So the same was probably true at Rome, but at Antioch, by the time of the leadership of Ignatius, AD 116, the principle of a monarchical as opposed to a collegiate bishop was firmly established. So setting up a monarchy, setting up this pasture the way they do today. As a bishop, which is from a Roman word, not a Greek word, because that Roman word is used because of the Roman picture of a Roman monarchy, the Caesar, these glorified, heroified men. So it says the principle of a monarchical as opposed to a collegiate bishop was firmly established, as was the distinction of church orders into episkopos, presbyteroi, and deaconoi. The responsibilities of the bishop were clearly set forth to supervise the liturgy and the sacraments, and in general to preside over the life of the church. At about the same time, the notion that these same bishops held office as successors of the apostles was taken for granted. the shape of the early church had all but completely emerged. Wow. So we've read what I wanted to read from Paul's metaphors and from the harvest of Hellenism. So we finished those two books. But there's more I would like to connect in pagan Christianity. This book, Paul's Metaphors, is by David Williams, and The Harvest of Hellenism by Effie Peters. But there's more I want to draw out from the Liturgeo and Liturgia from the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament by Gerard Kittel. And there's also more I would like to read from that entry in pagan Christianity, the order of worship, Sunday morning set in concrete, just to kind of tie that together for you, the way that it's used as a ritual of the law, as a way of making you conform to a law that was made by this oligarchy of powerful and men from colleges in a particular demographic. And that's why we have all these different churches with all these different degrees to them, different levels to them, which benefit a small group of men who are pleonectes, trying to get more and gain more and make money. And they're just using it as wrapping up this liturgy that's been kept from Isis, Horus, the Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, and the synagogues and the Grecian academics of Plato and Aristotle, and even the Zoroastrian, Persian, and the Babylonian, Persian, Grecian, Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, and this frontier revivalism, and this revivalism in general, which has guarded this corruption that started with Adam and Eve and Cain before the flood, and now, as it's been set forth in Revelations, is Babylon, who mothered all idolatry after the flood, which is Adam and Eve and Cain worship there with the serpent, and the serpent's the voice box of the beast, which is Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, Roman Catholicism, and the Protestant Reformation, because it's preserved that Babylonian system. That's why we're reading all this, because they've just wanted to throw away God and set up these men authorities. Like it says in Psalm 2, the kings of the earth set themselves. They set themselves. It says in Malachi that they call the proud happy, and they set them up. And it really is arrogance. Adam acted very arrogantly that day when he wanted to be a god and cast God out and set himself up as a god so he could be heroified. And we know that Nimrod, he trained his men in the thrill of the hunt to become killers. So first you hack up some animals, and then he'll use those people he trained to hack up people. And then he sets up these fortifications, and he was the Babylonian king. So this is all back to Babylonianism. And that college has been preserved, the college of the mysteries. And we see it in Rome. But first it was in Persia and Greece, and then Rome, and then it's been preserved through the Protestant Reformation that just took on tuxedos and is now even permeating people's homes through this same concept being portrayed by Reimagining Church by Frank Viola, and even in this book, Pagan Christianity. But we have to go there to glean out the facts, because people have done research which have preserved the truth, and that's why we want to glean those out. That's why we want to set these things in order, and we want to order our words aright, as it says in the Psalms. And that's who God honors, the scripture says, is when we set our words aright and we offer the fruit of our mouth and praise for him, like it says in Hebrews, which is our sole duty upon this earth to fear God and guard the commandments from loss, keep the commandments. So guard his word, and he preserves his word to the generations, and he uses us like the wine vat or the preservation jars where we put preserves in, and he uses us to preserve his word for the next generations. And it's a great honor and a great responsibility, and it's hard. So I hope y'all enjoyed the study, and I look forward to doing the next studies with y'all. And I'm nearing the end of the time, so I'll see you on the next video. All right, see y'all.